The Jets make a cut to clear out some salary cap space as the offseason approaches. We'll break it down today. It's Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, March 5th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, we have some Jets news to break down today as we approach the official or the unofficial beginning of the offseason next week. The Jets have released tight end CJ Uzomah. It's no surprise. In fact, if you went through the list of potential Jets cap releases that you were expecting before the start of free agency, Uzomah was really the only obvious guy because he's not really a guy who played that important of a role for this team. And cutting him saves over $5 million in cap space. So the breakdown is Uzomah was set to count for $11.2 million against the cap. Cutting him saves $5.921 million. Cutting him saves $5.3 million. There's $5.921 million in dead money. So there's actually more dead money than there is cap savings in this. And a lot of that goes back to a very ill-advised restructure the Jets made last year with Uzomah. And it speaks to a lot of issues the Jets have regarding the salary cap. But the Jets do create $5.3 million in new cap space. That increases their current projected cap space heading into the offseason to about $25 million or so, which, may sound like a lot on paper, but when you factor in everything the Jets need, and when you factor in the need to sign the draft class and need to have some leftover money to sign players once the season begins, Jets are going to have to create more cap space. This was one of the few easy mechanisms the Jets had to create salary cap space because, again, Uzomah did not really play much of a role for this team. If you look back 2 years when the Jets signed him, it's really difficult to figure what they were thinking because he was signed to a fairly lucrative contract, and they never really had a big role for him. They also signed Tyler Conklin that offseason, and Conklin kind of took over as the number one tight end right off the bat. Uzomah ended up being like a high-priced second tight end. He was an afterthought in the passing game. I mean, he wasn't a terrible blocker, but he's not a great blocker by any stretch of the imagination. Jets also drafted Jeremy Ruckert in 2022, 2 years ago. And, over the course of this season, Ruckert kind of took on that second tight end role. And, I mean, not that Ruckert's looked great, not that Ruckert has really flashed that much his first 2 years, but compared with what the Jets were getting from Uzomah, I don't think there's going to be much of a drop off. I remember the day the Jets signed Uzomah. It was early in free agency in 2022, and this was a point where Ryan Griffin was the tight end for the Jets. You may remember that guy. He was one of my favorites, and there was a run on tight ends, free agent tight ends early that year. And it almost felt to me like in the moment, like the Jets panicked a little bit and just threw out a lot of money at Uzomah because they were worried they were going to get shut out of the tight end market. Because that first day, like a lot of the tight ends agreed to terms with new teams. And I remember at the time I said, this was the type of move where I feel like you could justify it if you really believed Mike LaFleur, who was the offensive coordinator at the time, his offense needed tight end play that was average. And Uzomah, unfortunately, did not really give the Jets average play at the tight end position. It was, he really didn't give the Jets a whole lot. And that's why this cut is so easy because, it saves you over $5 million in cap space for a player who was really a role player and not a particularly valuable role player. Now, again, quite a bit of dead money, just under $6 million in dead money. And that puts the Jets' dead money total heading into the offseason for 2024 already at over $34 million. And that's quite a bit of dead money. Part of the issue is, so about like 14% of the Jets 2024 cap's already dedicated to players who aren't going to be here. And if you look at the list of players who account for this dead money, it's not like it's a list of great players. It's Lakin Tomlinson, Carl Lawson, Dwayne Brown, Jordan Whitehead, Super Bowl hero Mecole Hardman, Michael Carter, Nick Bawden. Quentin Jefferson might be the only player who contributed anything to the Jets this year who's got dead money. And, he was a nice rotational defensive tackle. It's not like he was a great player. It's not like he was a cornerstone player for this team. So, we've been talking about it for over a year now. Jets cap management is not that great. And, people always try and throw out this stuff like the cap doesn't matter. Well, again, that's $34 million the Jets have on their cap for players who aren't going to be here next year and players who really did not contribute much while they were here. You're telling me the Jets, with all of their issues, with all of the players they need to add on offense, the $34 million doesn't make a difference? And let's say half of that. Let's say they only had $17 million in dead money. The extra $17 million would go a long way. That $17 million might be able to get you a good tackle. So, I don't understand when people act like this is just monopoly money. It's not. And the way the Jets handled Uzomah is kind of like a good example of why their cap situation is the way it is. They restructured him last year, and the restructure lowered his 2023 cap number, but it increased the amount of dead money that would come when you cut him this year. Because again, Jets are actually taking on more dead money than they're saving. Now, they're ultimately, coming out ahead here because he would have cost $11.2 million. Now they save $5.3 million, but he still counts almost $6 million against the cap. And, there are a lot of cases like this. Lawson was another one where he was kind of an afterthought. And, I think you look at this and you say, these are examples of a year ago. The Jets, not really having good communication between the coaching staff and the front office. Because if you're going to have guys like Carl Lawson, be buried on the bench, or Uzomah, not getting an increased role, I mean, you should have just cut them, because these ended up being very highly paid backups, and the Jets needed to do financial gymnastics to get them in under the cap, which meant essentially keeping them on the books in 2024 when they're no longer here with dead money. And I don't mean to be overly critical, but this is part of the issue with the Jets right now, is that their cap is not in good shape. And it's not in good shape because they've made some moves that just really don't make a whole lot of sense. I think keeping Uzomah was one of them. This guy was not a valuable player for them in 2022, and he didn't really have that big of a role. I mean, could Jeremy Ruckert have played Uzomah's role in 2023? I think so. And I'm not saying I'm a huge Ruckert fan. I'm not saying Ruckert's done a whole lot to merit confidence, but we're comparing with Uzomah right now. Uzomah, by all accounts, is a great locker room guy. He's a good guy to be around. He was beloved in Cincinnati during his time with the Bengals. So I don't mean to, belittle him, but if we're talking, about signings, this was not a good signing by the Jets in 2022. This was not a signing that accomplished a whole lot. It was a lot of money for not a lot of production. And this ended up being a pretty obvious move for the Jets for those reasons. You don't like having moves like these. And that 2022 offseason for the Jets, the draft looks phenomenal. But what they did in free agency that year, outside of DJ Reed, is not looking so good. Because, two of their key signings were Lakin Tomlinson and CJ Uzomah. Well, now you've got two guys who are going to combine to count over $16 million against the cap in 2024, and they won't be here. A move that had to be made, but, a kind of a reminder of a number of areas where the Jets did not do that well a couple of years ago in the offseason. We're going to try and do better, though, this year. And ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to what else? The tackle position. There's been a development there that a player who's hitting the market who could interest the Jets might be a better fit than some of the other big names you hear about. I'll tell you who that is. I'll tell you why I think he may be a fit as we continue on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? A lot of us spend our times wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you, so you can do more of it. And therapy has so many positive benefits. It's helpful for learning coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's not just for those who have experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed as news breaks. Today, we're talking about the upcoming Jets offseason. We talked about the Jets clearing out a little cap space by cutting CJ Uzomah. I mean, with all due respect to CJ, not really a lot you can say that's good about his 2 years in New York. So we're looking to the future now. And it goes without saying, the Jets really need to do some work at the tackle position this offseason. I mean, nothing they did really was that effective in 2023. They went into the season with Dwayne Brown and Mekhi Becton. That did not work out in either case. The backups did not play well. Billy Turner, a veteran, was pretty bad when he was in there. They had some young guys, Max Mitchell, Carter Warren, who were not particularly impressive. The one guy who held up okay was Elijah Vera Tucker, but he got injured early on in the season. So what did the Jets do at the tackle position? Well, a player just recently hit the market a few days ago. He was kind of a cap cut from the Washington Commanders, Charles Leno. He's a longtime NFL player, a veteran. He's been in the league since 2014, so just completed his 10th season. A longtime tackle, guy who has plenty of experience, a guy who's been a starter for almost his entire career, really since his second season. He took over as a starter with the Chicago Bears in 2015. And Washington let him go. And, you hear a lot about some of the bigger names out there who are veterans, guys in their 30s. Tyron Smith is one. David Bakhtiari is obviously another one because of his connections with Aaron Rodgers. Bakhtiari, up until last year, blocked his entire career at the left tackle position in Green Bay for Aaron Rodgers. So you hear those names a lot. And I'm not a big fan of either of those guys. I'm a big fan of their games back when they were in their respective primes. And they're both actually, when they're on the field, they play at a high level, but both of those guys are injured an awful lot. And I feel like if you're going to go for a guy who's in his 30s, you want somebody who's shown durability. Dwayne Brown, the Jets got him at the end. The Jets got him way too late. They got him at 38. But Dwayne Brown, through most of his career prior to when the Jets got him, was really durable. And that's the kind of guy who can play well into his late 30s. And I'm not a big fan of the Jets adding more old players because I feel like last offseason things were too focused on bringing in guys who were on the wrong side of 30. But if you're going to bring in a guy who's on the wrong side of 30, make it somebody who's durable. And Dwayne Brown, through his first 14 seasons, only missed 22 games. In fact, 3 of the 4 seasons before he joined the Jets, he played every single game. He did not miss a game in 3 of the 4 seasons before he joined the Jets. If you look at Charles Leno Jr., I mean, in the last 9 years of his career, he's a 10-year guy. In the last 9 years, he's only missed 4 games. Now, the caveat, those 4 games were in 2023. The other catch with Leno is that he is having hip surgery. So everything I say comes with the caveat that I'm making the assumption that the Jets will check him out medically. And if he's not a go, then they'll pass on him. And of course, we've seen the last couple of years, the Jets have depended on some tackles coming off some rather serious injuries, and it hasn't always worked out. Sometimes they've leaned on guys who were not ready for the season, who were too injured to be able to make an impact right off the bat, and these things have lingered into the season. So of course I acknowledge the Jets will need to be careful with something like this. But if Leno's healthy enough to play week 1, to me, like, he's a better fit for this team than a Bakhtiari or a Tyron Smith, even though he's not as good of a player. He's never going to reach their peaks. I mean, when you're talking Bakhtiari or Tyron Smith, these are guys who are, future Hall of Famers. These are 2 of the best left tackles of their era, but these are guys who are also, near the end of their careers. And well, you can say that of Leno. Smith and Bakhtiari also have a lot of trouble staying on the field. Bakhtiari's played 25 games the last 4 years. Tyron Smith has missed 23 games the last 4 years. He hasn't played a full season. He hasn't played a full season where he's missed no games since 2015. And, it's easy to say, well, maybe they'll stay healthy. Maybe it's easy to gamble on them. You have to remember what they're doing. It is a spot. It's a game, first of all, but it's also a position tackle where you're just taking a constant pounding, play after play after play after play. And those things add up as the years grow. And, as you get older, as you get into your 30s, it becomes more difficult to recover. It becomes more difficult to bounce back from a grueling game, one after the other during the course of the season. And, I think it's easy to say, well, they could roll the dice and hope they stay healthy. It's a lot to ask, though. And I think, Bakhtiari especially, this is a guy who it feels like his body's falling apart. Again, 25 games the last 4 seasons. He's had 5 total surgeries on his knees. It just feels like his body's not going to hold up at this point. Tyrone Smith, I think, is a little bit more justifiable because he at least is coming off a season where he was, for the most part, was able to stay healthy. Only missed a couple of games with Dallas, but another guy who really you can't count on him to play a full 17 game slate. And that's the challenge, is that when you get to the offseason, when you get to free agency, the guys who are good, who are at tackle, they tend to have some sort of issue with them. And sometimes it's age, sometimes it's an injury history. I think in the case of Bakhtiari and Smith, it's both. And, while Leno is not as big of a name, that first of all means he'll probably be cheaper. Second of all, again, this is all contingent on him being healthy enough to play, on him being healthy enough to make an impact. And that's something the Jets medical staff will need to look at. But, he's a guy you could probably count on a little bit more to be healthy. Again, if everything pans out, he's a guy who's shown much more durability during the course of his career. And this is the challenge. I mean, you look at this free agent class. I mean, there aren't a lot of guys who are slam dunks at the tackle position. The guy I would really like is Mike Onwenu from New England. And he's played some guard. He's played a lot of guard, but he's held up pretty well at the tackle position when he kicked out there for New England. Now he's probably a right tackle. He's not a left tackle. And that's part of the challenge, is that, if you're the Jets, you don't want to go into the draft desperately needing a tackle, but you especially don't want to go into the draft desperately needing a left tackle. It's a little bit easier to find a right tackle than it is to find a left tackle. So, even Onwenu, who I think would be a good fit, he doesn't solve your problem at left tackle. And if you're going to go with a proven left tackle, you're probably going to have to roll the dice on somebody older. And to me, somebody like Leno is probably a better fit than, again, Bakhtiari or Smith. And once you get past those guys, if you look through the list of free agents, there aren't a lot of guys you can count on to play well. I mean, the thing I'll say about Bakhtiari and Smith is that when they're healthy, they're still very good. You can count on them to play well when they're in the lineup. The issues with them is more you can't count on them to be in the lineup. Leno might be the best of all worlds, and I don't love the idea. Look, I've been the guy for over a year saying, like, the Jets need to get younger. The Jets need to get guys in their prime. But if we're going to go with a guy who's going to turn 33 during the season, at least let it be somebody who has a history of durability, somebody who's shown that they can hold up. And, maybe that's the answer for the Jets at the tackle position. If nothing else, it gives them another option as we begin the offseason. Unfortunately, it feels like the options are dwindling at the wide receiver position. So the Jets may need to go to their plan B. And we'll discuss what that could be as we continue on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. It's an exciting time in the NBA. The regular season's starting to wind down. Some of the contenders are starting to assert themselves. New York Knicks having a good season. If we're talking about the locals, and there's battles for home court advantage, there's battles to avoid the play-in, there's battles to get into the play-in, a lot going on in the NBA. And on FanDuel right now, you can bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. Here on this Tuesday, we're talking about the upcoming offseason for the New York Jets. Of course, one of their top priorities is going to be the tackle position, which we just talked about in our second segment. We're going to move to their other big need, and that's the wide receiver position. And while there are now some more options at the tackle position with the release of Charles Leno, there are fewer options at the wide receiver position. Now, none of this is a big surprise. When you're a few weeks away from the start of the offseason, you see the list of potential free agents, and that list is always way better than the players who actually hit free agency, because in the weeks in the lead up to free agency, some players re-sign with their teams, some players get the franchise tag. Usually a lot of the top names leave the list. Usually a lot of the top names stick with their team through either the franchise tag or through a longer term extension. That was expected this year, and unfortunately, that's kind of the way things have played out. We talked yesterday, Mike Evans re-signs with Tampa Bay. He was a guy the Jets were expected to go after if he hit the market, but it was not really widely expected that he would hit the market. Michael Pittman, the Colts receiver, if he had hit the market, he should be the first option for the Jets. Doesn't look like that's happening. T. Higgins, great young receiver for the Cincinnati Bengals, maybe the top number 2 receiver in the NFL. He's the number 2 guy behind Jamar Chase, so that's not a knock on Higgins. Higgins would be the number 1 receiver on a lot of teams. In fact, you can make a case that he and Garrett Wilson It'd be a toss-up which of them would be the number one receiver on the Jets. So now if you look at like the top of the market, really the best guy available, the only guy who like really projects as a number one type receiver is Calvin Ridley from Jacksonville. And it's gonna be a tough one. As we mentioned yesterday, there were rumored 8 teams or so that were thinking about pursuing Evans. Now, Evans and Ridley are two different types of receivers. They don't really have the same type of game. But if you're looking for a high quality receiver and you were going to go after Mike Evans, it figures maybe not all of the 8 teams that were rumored are going to go after Ridley, but a lot of them are. And that's the classic case of supply and demand. If there's small supply, and in this case, there may only be one number one type receiver entering free agency, and lots of teams needing receiving help, it's going to be much tougher to land somebody. And the price is going to go up. And look, I think Calvin Ridley would make a lot of sense for the Jets if we're talking like under $20 million a year. But this is free agency in the NFL. There are lots of desperate front office, lots of GMs that have their job on the line. And they don't care if they overpay, because if they overpay and the move doesn't work out, they're getting fired anyway. It's somebody else's mess to clean up. That's true across the league. That's not just a Jets thing, although I think it does apply to the Jets this year. It's just true across the NFL that GMs don't really care about the long term. The few GMs that do are the ones who have job security, like Veach in Kansas City or DaCosta in Baltimore. Those are the guys that tend to be a little bit more patient. Teams that tend to play the free agent game a little bit better. But it's not going to be easy. And, it's almost like, look, I've been the number one fan of the Jets trying to get a big time receiver the last couple of years. And I think they passed on some guys who really could have helped them. Most notably, Amari Cooper 2 years ago when they could have had him for a 5. I said it at the time. A lot of people didn't like it, but it was true. But ultimately, you have to deal with the players who are available, not the guys you wish were available. Now, if Brandon Ayuk hits the trade market, that'd be a guy worth going after for the New York Jets. If somebody unexpectedly, if Justin Jefferson somehow becomes available in a trade, that's a guy obviously worth going after, because these are guys who make a big difference. These are guys who could change the fate of your offense. But short of that, I mean, if you look at this free agent class, it gets very thin after Ridley. And you may have to just throw away the dream, or at least defer the dream of getting another number one type receiver to play alongside Garrett Wilson. It may just be a case where you have to try and find a value guy. And that's not to say you go the cheapest guy possible, but you have to figure out what the market's going to be, because there's always that one guy out there who doesn't have the market materialize the way he's expecting. There's always that one guy who overplays his hand, ends up needing to settle for a 1 year prove it type of deal because they didn't get the contract they were expecting when they hit the open market. Would that be a Hollywood Brown? I'm not a big Hollywood Brown guy. I think he'd be a good addition at the right price. I think if he was the number 3 receiver, if the Jets were able to draft another receiver at 10 and make Hollywood Brown the number 3 behind Garrett and the guy they drafted, that would be a good move. Gabe Davis from Buffalo. Gabe Davis, if you get him, he brings an element that the Jets lack because he's kind of a good contested catch guy. That's not something they really have on offense. It's something Lazard should have at his size, but he doesn't. So and that Gabe Davis would also bring in kind of the double whammy effect because you take him off Buffalo. Is that a guy who maybe overplays his hand? Somewhere out there, some receiver's going to overplay his hand. And, there are some decent buy low candidates. Darnell Mooney, who out of Chicago, who, has had a 1,000-yard season on his resume and still runs pretty good routes, gets open, has the ability to make plays, and is, kind of been lost in the shuffle in a Chicago passing game that really hasn't done a whole lot. He could be a good buy low candidate, even though he hasn't done a whole lot productive the last couple of years. Tyler Boyd out of Cincinnati, a guy who's getting a little bit older, a guy who's been an overqualified third option in the Cincinnati offense. He may be aging past the point where he'd be there were years where Tyler Boyd would have been a good number 2 receiver. Maybe we might be getting past that point, but maybe he'd be a good third option. Maybe you could draft somebody, he'd be a good third option. But I think we're past the point. We might be zooming past the point where the New York Jets are going to be able to get a guy who's as good as Garrett Wilson or close to as good as Garrett Wilson. Now, the good thing is that Garrett Wilson can hold up on his own as a number 1 type receiver in this league. My dream's been to pair him with another number 1, because if you have 2 number 1s, your offense becomes much more difficult to defend. And again, if the trade market opens up, this could be a different story. But Jets may need to recalibrate here. They may need to go for just some more complementary options to fill in around Garrett, and then you will see what happens in the draft. And obviously, a lot of what the strategy will be at 10 will be determined by what the Jets do or don't do at the tackle position in free agency. If the Jets are able to at least get a couple quality offensive linemen in here, a couple quality receivers in here, the 10th pick becomes much less of a desperation type of pick. I always hate going into the draft having a glaring gaping hole. look, it's going to be very difficult for the offensive line and wide receiver to be strengths heading into the draft. But there's a difference between them being overwhelming strengths and being such weaknesses that you almost have to use the 10th pick at one of them. You want to be at a spot where, you know what, we could use an upgrade. It's perfectly fine to use the 10th pick because we still need an impact player here, and saying we absolutely have to use a pick. You know, the first category, you can kind of pick the guy who falls to you at either position. In the second position, if one of those spots is a desperate need, then you get yourself into big trouble, and it becomes much more difficult. So I think the Jets, at the very least, and I think it's going to be difficult to find a really good receiver. They need to get a couple guys in here who can at least play a little, who you can feel comfortable with as complementary options. So that way you don't head into the draft in utterly desperate shape. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. We'll do our weekly mailbag tomorrow, so send in your questions. Look forward to answering them.